I have seen a lot of takes flying around about Penn State and how they moved on from James Franklin. I know it was like a month ago and all this stuff, but all of them basically boil down to the same thing as we're getting closer and closer into this head coach for Penn State being fired. They all boil down to how could they fire a guy who just went 11 and 2, made the playoffs last year, was in the Final Four, and has three straight, 10-win seasons at the program. They want to say Pat Kraft panicked after 3 bad weeks. And of course, the national media has been peddling that Franklin, it was just one more example of how patience is dead. They did not want to use the LSU coach, the Brian Kelly, who they could barely pay his buyout. Heaven forbid they use that as an example with anything in the SEC. But I will say that if you're not in the national media and that's not where you're at, like if that's where you're at in your understanding of this, I get it somewhat, right? This is what has been fed to you because on the surface it looks that way. But the more you actually dig into what's been happening behind the scenes for the last 18 months, the more you realize this wasn't a snap decision after the Oregon, UCLA, and Northwestern stretch. And sure, that stretch contributed to the firing, but it was the end of a slow motion divorce that started long before a single snap was ever taken in 2025. Before we move on, please do take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button here. We are trying to get 5,000 subscribers before the end of the year and would really, really appreciate your support as we cover every Big Ten team and the Big Ten Huddle and push back against the national narratives that refute the SEC bias that exists in college football. All right, now, in order to have the conversation about Franklin, let's go back to the offseason, right? Because this didn't all just happen during the season. There was stuff leading up to this, and Landon Tangwell on his show did a really good job talking about this. And we're not going to talk about everything Landon Tangwell talked about, like that's not the entire show, but we do need to reference it because he did a really good job filling people in on this. Basically, James Franklin still had 6 years left on his monster deal that he had signed in 2021. Most coaches in America would kill for that kind of runway toward the end, but James and his representatives went to Pat Kraft and asked for a new extension anyway. Landon Tangwell, the former Penn State offensive lineman, talked about this on his channel. He said that Kraft's response was essentially that he had given Franklin everything he asked for. Unlimited assistant salary pool with Franklin's best staff ever assembled. I mean, you went out and got Stan Drayton, Jim Knowles, Andy Kotelnicki. Like there were a ton of really big name guys, a lot of really good coaches on the staff. Those are his words that this was his best staff ever assembled. He was even given the biggest transfer portal budget he had ever had, as well as facility upgrades like crazy too. And the message was clear: go win the big games this year, and then we'll talk. So, in other words, prove it. Prove it first. We've given you all this stuff. Prove it, and then we'll talk a contract extension. Franklin also said publicly in March that for the first time, he finally had the alignment he'd been asking for since he got to Happy Valley. By that, he meant that Penn State was finally spending like a place that wanted to win national championships. Kraft pushed every chip in the middle of the table for 2025 because he knew 2026 and 2027 were going to be rebuild years with all the departures coming out of 2025. But that wasn't enough for Franklin. When Kraft didn't immediately hand over a new contract to him and give him what he wanted, Franklin Franklin actually went around him to the university leadership. That's the part that really damaged this relationship between Kraft and Franklin because it was a huge mistake by Franklin since Kraft and the administration are already extremely close, and word got back to Kraft immediately after Franklin tried to go behind his back. You simply don't do that to the guy who just handed you the keys to this wild sports car that you've never driven in your life ever before. So by the time the season kicked off, the trust was already cracked between Franklin and Kraft. Frankly, like what I did there, I'm surprised it only took 3 games of losing for Pat Kraft to fire James Franklin, because not only was this what was all that an issue, but Landon brought up an even bigger issue, and one that a lot of national talking heads completely miss, is that Kraft and Franklin had different ways about how to rebuild the roster in the new world of NIL, NIL and the transfer portal. You see, Kraft wanted to be hyper aggressive. He was willing to write massive checks to portal players, even if it meant paying a transfer more than you paid a returning starter on your team. His attitude was the same of honestly many of the most successful coaches and the most successful programs in college football in the country, and that is that in this kind of business, feelings don't win championships, right? You want to try to stay loyal to your guys, but at the same time, you need to bring in better talent, and your spot is always competed for. And it was, like that to try and get the win in 2025 at all costs mentality. James Franklin was always cautious about disrupting locker room chemistry. And I get that. You want to have good locker room chemistry, you want to have culture, but you don't do that by not having competition on your team. He didn't want a transfer wide receiver making twice the money that Nicholas Singleton and Denida Sutton were making. He didn't want to bench a 1-year rental portal guy, because it would tank the kid's draft stock. He felt like it was a responsibility to him that he had to play him in order for him to get to the league. He didn't want to pay an 18-year-old 5-star recruit more than 95% of the roster. Loyalty and culture have always been his calling card, and that's honestly not a bad thing in a vacuum. Like, I'm not trashing James Franklin here. It's just that in 2025, that approach started to look outdated when everyone was swinging for the fences. You saw it play out on the field this season. You've seen it. Katron Allen be the biggest example. He has been clearly the better back this year, but carries were split because Franklin felt he owed Singleton, the time and the carries and everything. He came back, right? That's the kind of stuff that Sharon Moore was accused of doing in his first year as head coach. You shouldn't be accused of that when you're an experienced head coach like James Franklin. So young wideouts who looked electric in practice barely saw the field because of the 3 portal receivers who had got their touches for NFL film. And then you go back to 2018 and you see the same pattern. Koa Farmer started over Micah Parsons for half a season because Koa was a senior and a good soldier for the team. Again, none of this makes James Franklin necessarily a bad coach trying to have culture, trying to be loyal to his players. It makes him just a good coach whose core beliefs didn't line up with where college football is going, and more importantly, didn't line up with what his athletic director wanted to do. And let's talk about the NIL operations for a second too, because this is the part that really stunned people inside the building and really started to make people realize James Franklin isn't built for this at Penn State. Maybe he is someplace else, but not at Penn State, because Penn State finally had real money. Some estimates have them around $25 million when you combine collectives and the new Adidas revenue share deal. That's about top 15-ish in money in college football right now. Okay, so it wasn't like he was scraping for money, but under Franklin, they were still trying to act like it was 2019. You heard Chris talk about it on one of our head coaching search shows, which, by the way, check that out tomorrow morning, Thursday mornings. We always post one of those, and there's a lot to talk about this time. But he told a story of the top in-state safety recruit, Joey O'Brien, taking his official visit and Penn State not even presenting NIL numbers to him until the family was finally visibly upset and someone scrambled to put something together. That's not how you operate when USC, Texas A&M, and Tennessee are all writing 8-figure checks before the kid even finishes his dessert, right? Kraft wants the program to run like an NFL franchise, a real general manager, aggressive portal usage, pay the freshman. If he's a 5-star recruit, if he's a guy who can help you this year, pay him like somebody who's going to help you this year, right? Franklin never wanted a true GM. He wanted to keep the control and the culture to himself, the control of the program, everything. More on the control in a second. As Franklin was always about control, which made him bigger than the university. Todd McShay talked about this a ton on his show. He never went into all that much detail, but basically he called James Franklin out for being a selfish leader. And from what we know now, he's not necessarily wrong. In a somewhat recent Instagram post of Daily PSU, I think it was, the father of a previous 2026 Penn State defensive line commit, Alex Haskell, I believe he's committed to Syracuse now, commented to a Penn State fan Instagram account, like I think it was Daily PSU. I can bring it up here next to me. he was telling them that after being fired, James Franklin instructed his staff who worked in the recruiting and NIL department while still employed by Penn State to tell all Penn State commits that they needed to decommit. The staff knew they were following Franklin to Virginia Tech next year, but they still worked at Penn State to finish it out. So they told Penn State recruits to decommit. That's why you saw all the crazy numbers of LSU and Florida losing like one or two recruits, but Penn State lost almost 20 recruits because the program was never actually built on Penn State tradition, Penn State. It was always built on James Franklin. The program was built on him, his name, and who he was. It was all about him, but not all recruits were going to follow in Franklin's footsteps to Virginia Tech. Messiah Mickens just did. We just saw that happen yesterday, but that's why you saw other programs that fired coaches like LSU, Florida, Auburn only have a few decommits, and meanwhile Penn State had like 20. So the full quote of what he commented, it's here next to me, but I'll read it to you. He says, "No one in here knows what they are talking about. My son was committed to Penn State. The NIL department had all the commits reopen their recruitment and decommit because of the uncertainty of the program. What coach is going and who's staying, it really didn't have nothing to do with not wanting to play at Penn State without Franklin. Maybe a few kids, but it will know which kids sign on to Virginia Tech with Franklin." Like I said, Messiah Mickens just did that. Franklin's control and elevation of himself was never going to work long term. It does not work in college football. It used to work, but it does not work anymore in college football. So when people scream, Penn State just fired a guy who wins 10 games a year and they'll never find anything different, they're missing the point. You're not necessarily looking for a guy who's going, I mean, you obviously want a guy who's going to win more games than that, but you also want a guy who is in alignment and who is going to preach Penn State and not just his own name. This isn't about finding someone who can go 10-2 instead of, 11-1 instead of 10-2. I mean, that is about it somewhat, but it's also about finding someone who's willing to play the game and the and the way it's played in 2025 and beyond. Someone who's philosophically aligned with the athletic director, who finally has the resources and the green light to act like the big boys. James Franklin built Penn State into a consistent top 15 program and recruited a ton of NFL talent, brought them out of the sanctions and everything else back then. That's huge. And he should never be forgotten for that. But no one's taking that away from him. But the sport has passed a tipping point, and Penn State's leadership decided they needed a different kind of CEO for the next era, especially if you want to compete at the highest level to try and win national championships. The 3 losses late in the year didn't get him fired. They just made it more obvious to everyone, fans, players, recruits, and most importantly, the decision makers, that the partnership had run its course. That's the context a lot of the national voices are skipping when they call this a panic move. And everything that's going on behind the scenes made it so Franklin wasn't going to develop into what you needed to. Sure, maybe he could get better as a coach, but the way he ran the program was not the way it was. So people are just reading the box scores and the win totals. Kraft was looking 3-5 years, 10 years down the road, and decided the guy who got them to this point wasn't the guy to take them the rest of the way in the new landscape. And honestly, given where the money is now and where college football is headed, that's not knee-jerk. That's leadership. Sure, Penn State might hire a guy who, doesn't win as many games as James Franklin. That is always the risk you take. But at a certain point, we need to praise Penn State. Praise Penn State for being a program who actually wants to go out and compete and try to win national championships. Not every single program is like this. Some programs find a coach and say, well, he's good enough for us. I'm not going to name any coaches, but he's good enough for us. Maybe he doesn't win the conference. Maybe he doesn't, go to national championships, but boy, we get close to 8, 9, 10 wins every single season, and we pretty much have those many wins every single season. Might make the playoffs every now and then, but we're not national championship contenders. And credit to Penn State. They want to be national championship contenders, and credit to Pat Kraft. Is it going to work out? I don't know. We'll see. But at the end of the day, it sounds like Pat Kraft has a vision, and it sounds like Pat Kraft knows who he wants right now, and he's going to go out and find somebody that's actually going to win actually get them closer to winning national championships out there. And if it doesn't work with the first guy, oh well. You move on. You see what you got with the next guy. It is what it is. It's the world of college football. You got to take risks. But I would say I think it's much more likely that this program, with the investment that they're trying to put into college football, I don't think this is the next Nebraska. I don't think this is the next program that's going to fall off the cliff or anything like that. I think this is a program that's going to go out, find a good coach, bring him in, and give him all the resources he needs. And if he fails, that's going to be on him. I don't think it's going to be on Penn State. So let me know what you think about all of this. Am I right that people blaming Penn State are off base here, or do you think for whatever reason, James Franklin should have stuck around and they could have done more with him? Would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. And please do like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. We appreciate you being here. Have a good one.